My brother didn't know I owned the building he was trying to throw me out of. That's the part I keep coming back to. Even now, sitting in my car in the parking garage of the Harlow Tower, watching the security team change the locks on the 14th floor, I still can't fully process how completely he underestimated me. How completely all of them did. Let me back up. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I run a private equity firm called Vantage Point Capital out of Chicago, and for the past 3 years, I have been the silent majority shareholder of Harlow Consulting Group, the company my father built from nothing. The company my brother Marcus has spent the last 5 years convincing himself he built from something. Nobody in my family knew any of that, not my brother, not my mother, not my Uncle Pete, who flew in from Phoenix specifically to watch me get humiliated at a board meeting he'd been told would be a formality. It was a formality. Just not the kind any of them expected. I need to tell you about my father first, because none of this makes sense without him. Dad started Harlow Consulting in 1998 out of a one-bedroom apartment in Evanston. Corporate restructuring consulting. The kind of work where companies hire you to come in and tell them everything they're doing wrong, and then you help them fix it. He was good at it. Exceptionally good. By the time I was in middle school, we had moved to a real house in Wilmette, my brother had his own car, and my father had a name in Chicago business circles that people actually recognized. He also had a rule. One rule, and he said it to Marcus and me every single time the subject of the business came up at dinner. You earn your place. Nobody inherits a seat at my table. I believed him. Marcus heard something different. Marcus is 4 years older than me. He's charming the way a used car salesman is charming. You feel good in the moment, and then you're on the highway and you smell something burning. He joined the company right out of college, and Dad put him in business development, which suited him perfectly because Marcus can sell anything to anyone as long as he doesn't have to deliver on it later. I went a different direction. I got my MBA from Northwestern, spent 3 years at a consulting firm in New York, then came back to Chicago and started working in private equity. I was quiet about it. I've always been quiet about money. My father taught me that too, even if he never said it out loud, the way he never talked about our finances at family dinners, never bragged to neighbors, always drove a car that was one step below what he could afford. Dad had a stroke in the spring of 2021. He survived, but it changed him. His memory started going in pieces, not all at once, not dramatically, just quietly, like a tide going out. By the end of that year, he stepped back from Harlow Consulting and named Marcus acting CEO. That was when things started to shift. I visited the office a few times in early 2022. I noticed things. The receptionist I'd known for years was gone. 2 senior consultants who had been with my father since the beginning were suddenly pursuing other opportunities. The office on Michigan Avenue. My father's pride, the one with the view of the lake, was being subleased to cover expenses Marcus couldn't explain clearly when I asked. That was my first mistake, according to Marcus. You don't work here, Claire, he said, not rudely, but with this patient condescension that made me want to flip the conference table. You consult for other companies. This is our family's company. Leave it to the people who are actually here. I left it. For about 6 months, I left it. And then I started looking at the financials. My father had always been meticulous about documentation. Every contract, every invoice, every revenue projection, all of it organized and stored. When he stepped back, he gave me access to the family trust's financial records, not because he suspected anything, but because I was the one who always sat with him during tax season, the one who actually understood what she was reading. What I found over the course of 4 months of very quiet, very careful review was this: Harlow Consulting Group was bleeding. Not from bad business, the client roster was strong, the revenue was there. What was disappearing was profit, and it was disappearing into a series of vendor contracts that didn't make sense. A technology modernization initiative that had consumed $340,000 with nothing to show for it, a strategic advisory retainer paid to a firm I'd never heard of, and a lease agreement for a satellite office in Naperville that, as far as I could tell, had never been used by a single Harlow employee. I hired a forensic accountant. Quietly. I paid her out of my own pocket. It took her 11 weeks. When she was done, she called me on a Tuesday afternoon and said, in the flattest possible voice, Claire, someone has been systematically stripping this company. The strategic advisory firm in the vendor contracts. It was registered to an LLC that traced back through 2 holding companies to my brother's college roommate. I sat with that information for 3 days. I didn't sleep much. I thought about my father, who was in a memory care facility in Glenview by then, who had good days where he remembered my name and bad days where he called me by my mother's name from 30 years ago. I thought about what he would do. He would have been methodical. He would have been patient. He would not have made a single move until he was holding every card he needed. So I got to work. The first thing I did was retain a securities attorney named Howard Chen, who I'd worked with twice before on private equity deals. Howard is 62, has an office full of plants he refuses to name, and is the least dramatic person I have ever met, which is exactly what I needed. "Walk me through what you want," he said. "I want to protect the company," I said, "and I want to make sure that whatever happens next, Marcus can't undo it." Howard looked at me over his reading glasses. "How much capital do you have available?" I told him. He wrote something on his notepad and didn't react at all, which is how I knew the number was sufficient. Over the next 8 months, Vantage Point Capital, my firm, quietly purchased shares of Harlow Consulting Group. Not all at once, not obviously. We went through a nominee structure which is entirely legal when done correctly, and Howard made sure it was done correctly. We bought from 3 minority shareholders who were happy to exit, an early angel investor who'd been trying to liquidate for years, a former employee who held equity from a 2015 retention package, and an outside partner who had grown frustrated with the direction of the company. When it was done, Vantage Point held 51.3% of Harlow Consulting Group. I owned the company my brother thought he was running. I didn't do anything with that information for another 4 months. I watched. I had Howard draft a shareholder action plan. I worked with the forensic accountant to compile everything, every suspicious transaction, every vendor contract, every LLC registration into a binder that was, by the end, nearly 2 inches thick, and I waited for Marcus to make the move I knew was coming. He made it in March. Marcus called a board meeting. He sent the notice to the 4 board members, himself, my Uncle Pete, a family friend named Douglas who'd been on the board since the beginning and genuinely had no idea what was happening, and the 4th seat, which technically belonged to the family trust. The family trust seat was mine. Marcus knew this. He invited me anyway because he thought the meeting was going to go his way and he wanted me there to watch. The stated purpose of the meeting was strategic restructuring and leadership transition. What that meant, I knew from a conversation my cousin had overheard and relayed to me, was that Marcus intended to formally dilute the family trust's shares through a new funding round, which would reduce my position to a minority stake and remove my ability to block major decisions. He'd found a private investor willing to participate. He had Douglas's proxy vote already secured through what I can only describe as a deeply misrepresented conversation. And he'd flown my Uncle Pete in from Phoenix specifically to vote yes. He had the votes as far as he knew. What he didn't know was that the shareholder whose vote actually controlled the outcome wasn't the family trust. It was Vantage Point Capital. And he hadn't invited Vantage Point Capital to the meeting because he didn't know Vantage Point Capital was in the room. But I was. The meeting was held at the Harlow offices on Michigan Avenue, the 14th floor. I had been in that room maybe 100 times. I used to sit in the corner and do homework while my dad worked late when I was 10 years old. And he'd bring me a hot chocolate from the machine down the hall and ruffle my hair and say, "Watch and learn, kid." I arrived early. I wore a gray blazer I'd bought specifically because my father used to wear something almost identical. Small things mattered to me. Marcus arrived 7 minutes later with his attorney, a man named Philip who specialized in corporate law and had the look of someone who charged a lot and delivered approximately half of what he promised. My Uncle Pete was already seated. Douglas nodded at me warmly. He's a good man. He just trusted the wrong person. Marcus glanced at me when he came in. He smiled the way he always smiles. Wide, confident, already halfway through whatever script he'd been running in his head. "Claire," he said, "thanks for coming." "Of course," I said. Howard was sitting to my left. Marcus looked at him and then looked back at me. "Is this your attorney?" "He's here in his capacity as counsel for Vantage Point Capital," I said. "We hold an interest in this company and we have some things to add to the agenda." Marcus's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. It got tight around the edges, the way a mask shifts when the person behind it isn't sure what's coming. Vantage Point Capital isn't a named stakeholder, Philip said, already reaching for his folder. They are now, Howard said pleasantly, and he slid the share purchase documentation across the table. The room went quiet. I watched my brother pick up the first page. I watched his eyes move across the document. I watched the specific moment. It lasted, maybe 2 seconds, when he understood what he was reading. His face didn't go pale. It went something worse than pale. It went blank, the way a screen goes blank when the system underneath it crashes. This isn't, he started, and then stopped. Philip put his hand on Marcus's arm. Philip was, to his credit, a faster processor than my brother. He'd already flipped to the back pages, already found the execution date, already understood that this wasn't a surprise filing or a procedural error. When did this transfer occur? Philip asked Howard. 7 months ago, Howard said. All regulatory filings are attached, pages 12 through 19. My Uncle Pete said, "What is happening right now?" Nobody answered him immediately because there was a lot of paper moving around the table. Marcus looked at me. For the first time in probably a decade. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when we were kids and I'd beaten him at something. That particular combination of anger and disbelief and something underneath both of those things that I can only describe as the unwilling recognition that he'd miscalculated badly. "You bought shares," he said. "You actually..." He stopped again. "From who?" "From 3 minority shareholders who wanted to exit," I said. "It was an arm's-length transaction. Everything was properly disclosed to the relevant parties at the time of transfer. You should have told me. I had no obligation to tell you. Shareholders are not required to notify management of private secondary market transactions when the company's operating agreement doesn't require right of first refusal, which yours doesn't, because you removed that provision in 2022. "Howard, which page is that on?" "Page 23, Howard said. "The amended operating agreement signed by Marcus Harlow as acting CEO. Marcus had removed the right of first refusal provision because it had been slowing down a deal he wanted to close quickly. I know because I found the board minutes from that meeting in my father's files. He removed the only mechanism that could have protected him from exactly what I had just done. The silence in that room was very different from regular silence. It had weight to it. My Uncle Pete was reading the share transfer document with the focus of a man trying to make sense of something in a language he almost speaks. Douglas had set down his papers and was looking at the table. Philip leaned over to Marcus and said something quietly. Marcus shook his head once sharply. Then Marcus looked at me again, and his voice, when it came, was quiet and hard. "You did this behind my back." "I made a legal investment in a company with which I have a family connection," I said. "I did it correctly, and I documented everything. That's not behind your back, Marcus. That's business. Dad built this company. I know what Dad built." I kept my voice level. "I also know what's been happening to it for the last 3 years. And since we're all here, Howard, would you distribute the second set of documents, please?" Howard opened the second folder, the forensic accounting report. All 2 inches of it. I'm not going to walk through every detail of what came next because some of it is still in the hands of attorneys and I'm not supposed to discuss specifics. What I will tell you is this: Douglas, when he understood what he was reading, put down the report and said, very quietly, "Marcus, this isn't right." That was the last thing he said in that meeting, but it was enough. My Uncle Pete asked to take a break. During the break, he called my mother. I don't know exactly what he said to her, but she called me 40 minutes later, and she didn't say hello, she just said, "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." And I told her I needed her to read the report before we talked. Philip recommended an adjournment. Marcus refused at first, and then agreed, and then sat very still for several minutes looking at the window. The dilution proposal was tabled. It has not come back. Harlow Consulting Group is currently under financial review by an independent auditor. Marcus has stepped back from his role as acting CEO pending that review, which was not voluntary but was framed that way publicly. The 2 vendors at the center of the forensic accountant's report are being examined. I am not the CEO of Harlow Consulting. I don't want to be. What I wanted through all of this, was to protect what my father spent his life building from the person who was quietly taking it apart. I've retained an interim CEO, a woman named Sandra Park, who has 20 years in corporate restructuring and no personal attachment to anyone in my family, which makes her exactly right for the moment. My father is in Glenview. He has good days and bad days. On the good days, I sit with him in the sunroom, and sometimes I tell him things are okay at the company, and he nods and looks out at the courtyard and says, "Good. That's good, kid." I don't tell him more than that. He doesn't need to know the details. He just needs to know the thing he built is still standing. It is. For now, because of the work I did quietly, behind the scenes without telling anyone what I was doing or why, exactly the way he taught me. My brother called me 2 weeks after the board meeting. I almost didn't answer. I did. He didn't apologize. I didn't expect him to. What he said was, "I didn't think you cared about the company." I held the phone and looked out my office window at the lake 17 floors below, gray and flat in the February light. "I know," I said. "That was your mistake." He didn't say anything else. I let the silence sit there for a moment, and then I said, "Marcus, the auditors are going to find everything. You should talk to a lawyer, not Philip, someone who actually specializes in what you're about to need." Then I hung up. I sat in my chair for a while after that. I thought about my dad in his apartment in Evanston in 1998, working by himself, building something. I thought about the hot chocolate from the vending machine and the way he'd ruffle my hair and say, "Watch and learn." I watched. I learned. I just took a little longer than anyone expected. People always ask me if I feel guilty. Like I should have warned Marcus or given him a chance to come clean on his own, or handled it more quietly within the family before it got to where it got. I used to turn that question over in my head a lot during the months I was building the case. Late nights, bad coffee, spreadsheets open on 2 monitors, and somewhere in the back of my mind, do I have the right to do this? Is this too far? And then I'd go back to the numbers. Another vendor payment to a shell company. Another month of staff salaries delayed. Another piece of what my father built, quietly gone. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about family loyalty. Loyalty runs both directions. Marcus made a choice, and he made it over and over again for years, with full knowledge of what he was doing. He didn't stumble into it. He constructed it, carefully, behind the face of someone who showed up to every holiday dinner and hugged our mother and talked about the family legacy like he was its guardian. What I've come to understand, not from a book, not from anyone telling me, just from living through it, is that actions accumulate. Every decision you make builds something, even when you can't see it. Marcus built something too. He just didn't account for the fact that I was building something at the same time in the opposite direction. My father used to say that the most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody's watching. He meant it as business advice. I think about it differently now. The people who underestimate you aren't just giving you an advantage, they're making a bet against themselves. Every time Marcus dismissed me, every time he said, "You don't work here, Claire," every time he left me off an email chain or forgot to mention a board decision, he was freeing up space for me to move. And I moved. That's not cleverness. That's patience, which is a different thing entirely. Cleverness is knowing the right answer quickly. Patience is being willing to wait until the right moment actually exists and not forcing it before it does. I waited 8 months after I had the forensic report before I walked into that board meeting. 8 months of sitting on information that made me furious because the moment wasn't right yet, and I think about what my dad would say if I told him all of it. The shares, the accountant, Howard and his plants, the silence in that conference room. I think he'd look at me the way he used to look at me when I got something right at the dinner table when I was 12, where he wouldn't say much but his eyes would do the thing. Like he wasn't surprised, but he was pleased anyway. He taught me to watch. He taught me to learn. He taught me that the work you do quietly without announcing it, without needing anyone to witness it, is the work that actually holds. I'm still learning that, but I'm not done yet, and I know which direction I'm building.